Understanding conventions of a short film was crucial when creating my own. There are a variety of conventions that allow any audience to recognise a short film. Some of these include a quirky narrative, a variety of genres that are blurred into one, a twist in the storyline, a typically low budget, and a short duration running from 1 to 40 minutes. Short films are a great platform for amateur or independent filmmakers such as myself, due to the low budget and creative outlet for narratives. It can be difficult to define these conventions, as apart from having a set running time, there is no set criteria that apply to short films, and the title short film can describe any forms and genres of filmmaking. When planning Take Two, I wanted to blur the lines of fantasy and realism genres, sticking to the typical conventions of short films, where the genres can be blurred and mixed. When applying both fantasy and realism, the conventions can be hard to define, as typical conventions of one may not fit into another. Conventions of realism films can include a realistic setting and situations, and this was a convention I brought into my short film. The fantasy element can be very subjective, but when looking at time loop film conventions, you can see many have positive outcomes, an element of magic, which can be seen in Take Two with the main protagonist moving through time, and props that move the storyline forward, which in the case of Take Two was the watch. To aid my understanding into fantasy and realism ideas and elements, I watched a variety of short films that would help me in developing my own. These included Rocket by Jennifer Sheridan, The Present by Jacob Frey, and The Friend Catcher by Lucy Campbell. All these short films focus on realistic settings and simple narrative structures. These simple elements have a huge effect on the audience, as they can easily relate with the storyline due to the setting and immerse themselves into the narrative due to its simplicity of its structure, without having any long contextual detail, which you may have for a feature-length film. The short film The Present has a very emotional moral message that emerges throughout the narrative. This is enhanced by only one or two main characters, and I have seen this convention and trend throughout all the short films I've analysed. To further enhance emotive narratives and relatable situations, close-ups and reaction shots are used throughout all of the short films, and this plays well the target audience they are looking to adhere to. I use these aspects of the short film and try to incorporate them into Take Two, using one main protagonist, having close-up and reaction shots, realistic settings such as parks and offices, and relatable situations that could happen to any of my target audience within their own life. Since short films are hard to be defined by set conventions, it can be hard to portray which conventions I actually conformed and subverted. When thinking about aspects of realism I added into my film, I conformed to keeping a realistic setting throughout all of Take Two, having locations such as parks, offices and bedrooms that will be similar to those of the target audience within their own life. This decision kept locations realistic and didn't delve away into the fantasy aspect due to the lack of budget. I wanted my target audience to feel some connection with the main character, and the locations would help towards this, as they can put themselves into the shoes of the protagonist. I did subvert the mise-en-scene seen normally within fantasy films. Popular fantasy films such as Lord of the Rings and Alice in Wonderland, with big conglomerate budgets, can afford impressive props, costumes and specialist lighting. By making a short film, not a feature film, I've already subverted these conventions due to the budget I was using and the more quirky narrative I was creating. My main aim throughout this process was to create a film that related to the everyday problems of teenagers. These examples did not do this, and this is why my film leans more towards the fantasy realism genre. I conformed with conventions of lighting when it came to realism within my film. I kept a natural lighting throughout, so not to veer away from the protagonist's acting and overall narrative of the film. When looking at narrative theory, there are some that can be applied to my storyline structure in Take Two. Forking Path was part of Alan Cameron's research into modular narratives in contemporary cinema. This idea that the narrative shows alternative versions of the story, which might result in small changes, is exactly what my protagonist does when she makes a mistake. She presses her watch and presents a fork path narrative in which we see an alternative version of her day. Take 2 uses a variety of enigma codes, which I developed from my previous analysis of short films. I wanted to leave some aspects ambiguous to the audience for the entirety of the film, such as why does the watch go back in time, and will she get back to her prior self when she transports to her younger self? I've seen this technique before, including in the short film Rocket, in which the dog ventures to space and leaves the audience with a variety of enigma codes, including how had the dog made the rocket, and how did the dog get himself into space? These enigma codes are popular within the fantasy genre, as they are obviously aspects that would not happen within a real life, so leaves the audience with a wider imagination on what and how. While completing my short film, I also learned conventions of film posters and reviews as part of my ancillary tasks, while still working on both conventions of fantasy and realism. I decided to focus my film poster on the realism side of my genres, as I felt this was going to entice my audience into the film more than focusing on the fantasy element. I used the film poster for Sliding Doors as my inspiration for my poster, using similar fonts and structure that were both simple and effective. Sliding Doors was a great poster to conform to, as its time loop style matches the same kind as Take 2. The poster presents a stronger sense of realism genre than it does fantasy, so not everything is given away to the audience from the poster alone. Sliding Doors uses 2 medium shots for its main image, and I similarly conform to this using just 1 medium shot for my poster, giving clear details of the film including the watch, the main protagonist, and the location. My review is very similar to the famous Empire magazine style. I didn't veer away from this style, and although this allowed less creative freedom, it follows very similar conventions of the magazine's layout, language, and style. You can see this in some of the language I use within my own review, including when I try and include a comedic tone. When I say the male actor would be more at home in a Pine furniture store wearing a price tag than trying to convince us he's a potential employer. This follows the same witty style seen in many Empire magazines today. The review focuses more towards film buffs who have extensive knowledge into the industry and understand complex and analytical writing. Although it did not target my audience effectively, it did fit its purpose for a review that was professional and mirrored those seen in Empire magazine today.